Welcome to the Deconstructed Woman podcast, a podcast about breaking down barriers between women, exploring and sharing perspectives of each individual woman's experience, and discovering what we have in common and what makes us different. Hosted by Elisa Marie and Joji.
Welcome, everyone, to the next episode of The Deconstructed Woman. Today's a really special day. We have two guests with us today, along with Alyssa and myself, and we are doing our very first interview. And so I'd like to welcome Michelle and Samantha to our podcast. They have been involved in podcasting for a couple of years, and they've been a huge set, encouraging voices for me and Alyssa as we wanted to start our own podcast. And so I'm going to jump in because I want to take most of this time to focus on these two very, very highly accomplished women in their early 30s and get their perspective. So Michelle and Samantha, what motivated you guys to start your podcast a couple of years ago? Tell us the name of it for our listeners and give us a little bit of history and sort of like the evolution of it to where it is today.
Yeah, so we're really excited because we just rebranded our podcast. It went from Status Post Adulting to now Build a Wealthy Spirit. And so Sammy and I started thinking about a podcast a couple of years ago. It started actually when we went to a wedding of two of our friends in Uganda, and they had planned this really, really amazing trip for everybody. They had such cool, smart, interesting friends, and we were having all of these really amazing conversations. And we kind of joked that it felt like adult summer camp. And while we were talking to everybody, we were sharing all of these things that we had learned and that we were interested in. And somebody was saying to us, they're like, oh, maybe you should start a podcast. And so that planted the seed for us. And then at the end of 2020, we both ended up being at home with our parents in the Bay Area for the first time. And so we decided, hey, we have a little bit of extra time. We're going to be together. Maybe now is the time to start the podcast. And so we launched it at the beginning of 2021, and we have been going strong for 2 years now, which is pretty crazy. And it's been amazing. We've been able to share topics that we find really interesting. A lot of our listeners reach out to us and tell us how different topics have impacted them or helped them decide, say, oh, I need to start a budget or I need to set up an emergency fund. Because a lot of what we talk about is around setting up financial security so that you can actually then plan to be aligned with different values that you have in life.
Samantha, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, so we decided to start this podcast, and I think one big theme in both Michelle and our lives at that time was this idea of finance and using finance to create a life that is in alignment with your values. So that's really like the crux of our podcast in general.
I was going to jump in because I really love this concept, but can you talk a little bit about what you mean by aligned with your values? Because I have heard so many different takes on that. And I'm just curious how you guys approach it.
Yeah. So, each person will have a different set of values. But I think a lot of people in their lives crave things like more time to especially do things that align with their values. So we all spend a lot of time at work. And I think, another big center point of our podcast is this idea that if you use your money wisely, then you can create more time for yourself in some manner, whether that means leaving the workforce completely or, maybe creating a side hustle on the side or going part-time. It's about using your financial stability to create runway so that you can really pursue things that you really align with. And I'll hop in there too. Sammy and I talk a lot about in our own lives how when we were setting goals for ourselves and building up a life for ourselves, we were sort of trying to checkbox our way to success. So go to university, get a good job, make money. And once we started making like good money in our 20s, we were stable. We almost didn't know what to do at that point. So for us, we just kept spending money. We were going to Vegas 4 times a year. We would eat out almost every single meal. I had a stylist at one point. Like, we were dropping money on the most random things. And so as we started to learn a little bit more about personal finance, we started to reframe our thinking and just think, okay, actually, what are the things that we value? Like, what are we spending money on the things that actually mean something to us? And so I think we realized that a lot of the money we were spending was actually not even things that we cared about. We were just reacting to like media or marketing. And when we actually looked at what we enjoyed, I know for me, there were a lot of things where I was like, oh, actually, I don't even care about this. This doesn't get me excited. But I just wasn't thinking about it. I was just doing what everybody else was doing.
So I have a question for you. So they say millennials are from anybody who's born from 1981 to 1996. And I was looking at some research about millennials just because I was curious about, I knew we were going to focus a little bit on financial here. And so I found an article in it's newamerica.org, and it's focused on this group called the Financial Health Network. And one of the things that they did was they studied millennials, and they looked at millennials through the lens of financial health. And they came up with like 8 components to sort of assess the financial health and what the criteria was. And they found that like 24% of millennials are financially healthy, 54% are financially coping, and 22% are financially vulnerable. How does that connect with what you're experiencing as you're talking to your friends and peers about financial health? Does that make sense to you? Is that spot on? Is that off the mark? What do you guys think?
Yeah, Joji, I think that is kind of spot on. I think, especially like Michelle was talking about, when we were younger and we were, we had just gotten our jobs, we had good paying jobs, but at the same time, we were spending a lot of our money on going out, eating at restaurants, going on trips. And we had a lot of fun, but we weren't paying attention to, whether that truly brought us joy. And I think a lot of people do that. I think when we talk to our peers, we see a lot of people, even if they have good jobs, even if they are making a lot of money, there is this kind of notion in our society to spend your money, whether that's like consumeristic in purchasing items or on trips or on other things. There is a notion that you should be spending your money, and there isn't as much emphasis on saving your money. So I think that idea that, there's like a quarter, it sounds like, of people who are, or maybe a little more than that, who are financially stable, and then other ones who are not so much. I think a lot of that probably comes from our consumeristic culture. And I think with millennials, especially, I do think a lot of that was projected on us to actually use our money to buy things or experiences, but regardless, not to save our money. And like Sammy was saying, when it comes to our background and what we see with a lot of our friends who reflect the way we are, first or second generation families, people who didn't really have a great personal finance education, at least in the case of our parents and our school system, we didn't really learn much about saving money or what to do with extra money because we didn't have a lot of extra money. We just had a couple keystones that our parents told us, which was, luckily, don't get into credit card debt. So that was a big one that I think we were lucky to avoid, and a big one that now in hindsight, I can see probably helped us build financial stability. And the other one was also my mom. I remember when I started my first full-time job, she bothered me for 6 months to start my 401k. And I was just dragging my feet. I didn't really understand why it was important. And it's crazy now to me to look back almost a decade later and see how much that money has grown, whether or not I've been putting money into it every single year. So we did have a few things that we had learned because our parents have taught us that, but there was so much we didn't know. And so what we find is that a lot of millennials are like that. Personal finance wasn't really a big topic when we were growing up, especially since our parents were just trying to make do and try to give us the best life that we could, but they didn't have this, extra money or things like that. Yeah. And, another thing, When it comes to millennials, I do think, as far as the financially secure millennials, I do think there are a lot of millennials who are leading some of these kind of frugality movements, like financial independence and retire early, or FIRE, or minimalism. I think a lot of millennials are kind of leading the charge on those movements. So I think the idea of financial security is becoming more popular with millennials, and for the purpose of freedom.
And Alyssa, you're also a millennial, and I think we've mentioned this before. And so, what do you find what we're talking about, and how does that affect your life, given you're in a different family sort of composition?
Yeah, I'm over here nodding my head for the most part, because I think that all is my experience as well. I think that, going back to the article that you were citing, Joji, one of the factors that it said, that as we were kind of coming into the workforce, we had some things, we're coming out of this depression and moving into just stages of things that have occurred in our very early introduction into the workforce that have kind of worked against us. But I would agree with the notion of, I had the same kind of feedback, like, don't get into credit card debt. And I went to college on full scholarship, so I didn't have loans, and I was, doing really well and kind of moving in that direction. But I didn't have the savings piece of it. And so then I moved into, the stage of my husband and I starting to have children, and starting to say, okay, we want to buy a house and we want to do all these things. And it was like, well, how do you do that? And it was interesting to hear from my friends and peers. They're like, well, you take out loans, or you do this or that. And all of it seemed very financially risky. And so instead, we just said, we're going to wait. And so we had 2 kids before we bought a house. And, I think in my mind, I was like, I need to, get married, buy a house, have kids. Like, it needed to go in a certain order. But the reality is, financially, that wasn't going to work for me. So I think that I'm sure there's a million different ways to look at it, but I think that all of that rings true for me as well. And I have kind of bought into or looked at a lot of financial peace university, Wallet Win Academy, all of these different, what they deem to be ways to learn how to manage your money. They're pretty straightforward. They're pretty common sense. But even in light of that, I still think I struggle personally with finances, of just trying to make it all work. And I think my financial situation, we're a 1-income household. And I think that that's due in this day and age, 3 kids and 2 cars and a mortgage and all of that, trying to balance it. But I think it was interesting from the article, because it did talk about things. It didn't talk about the specific 8 factors, but it was saying ways that you're financially healthy is like paying your bills on time. I'm like, oh, well, I do that, so I must be at least somewhat, in a better direction. But there's a lot of factors that go into that. So I don't know if that kind of gives my gist of where I'm at.
Yeah, and do you, as we are talking about, like single millennials versus married with children's millennials, do you find that that there's pressure socially from your friends to keep up with the Joneses? I mean, I can imagine that if you're single and you're in a professional role and you're making good money, that you might want to be like, oh, I want to go buy a fancy car, like I want to drive a BMW or a Mercedes. I mean, isn't that the sign of success? Maybe in today's environment, like a Tesla, like isn't that what looks like success? And I think it's really hard, though, to say, do I need those status symbols, or am I really investing for the future, for whatever that's going to bring me? How do you guys react to that? I'm going to start with Sammy and Michelle, because they are single and they do probably have less expenses than a family does, Alyssa. But I'm curious about the pressure they may or may not feel from their friends to keep up with them or not.
Yeah, Joji. When I hear about this, especially keeping up with the Joneses, I think that is why it is so important to be careful about the people you keep around you. They say you're like an aggregate of the 5 people you surround yourself with. And that is so true. Like when I think about me going to work as a physician assistant, people in the medical field are like notoriously not good about their money. So they are sometimes buying some of those flashy status symbols or like a fancy car. But I think Michelle and I have been very grateful to have had some really grounded friends as well. That same friend that we had gone to the wedding in Uganda, a few years prior to that, we had actually visited her in Austria, where she was living at the time because she was working for the United Nations. And when we visited her, she was living in this apartment. She was actually getting a housing stipend. She chose a home that was significantly less than the housing stipend. And then they were also Airbnb-ing a room in their home. And we looked around and they also were growing herbs that they were using instead of buying herbs that can sometimes be expensive to buy fresh herbs. And I remember looking at all this stuff, like as we were staying there, and I thought to myself, I'm like, this is kind of interesting. So I asked her, I'm like, hey, like, what are you guys doing? Like, I know you guys are into investing. I know you guys are being really responsible with this Airbnb and these herbs. Like, what is going on? And she's the first one that really introduced me to the idea of financial independence and retiring early. She's like, oh, have you heard of the FIRE movement? And at that time I was like, what is that? So there's this FIRE movement, financial independence, retire early movement. And the center point of that movement is this idea that, instead of just saving 10% of our income, like we might be encouraged to do, if we save even more, like 50% of our income, we can actually save enough to create enough money to live on forever. And this is, there's a whole community around this, but one of their principles is this idea that there is a 4% rule. So if you take whatever your annual spending is, you times it by 25, that's the amount of money that you could live on forever, assuming a 4% return, you would live on that 4% return. For example, if you lived on $60,000 a year, you would times that by 25. That's $1.5 million. And that's the amount of money you would need to live forever. Because if that had a 4% return every year, then you would have $60,000 that you could spend on your living expenses.
Exactly, Sammy. And I think that really ties back to this idea of keeping up with the Joneses, because when you are keeping up with the Joneses, what you're really doing is looking at the people around you. You're looking at what looks like wealth. You see the Tesla, you see the big houses, you see the private schools, or whatever that is for your community. And you think, oh, I need to do that too. And those people look wealthy. But actually, a lot of times what we've realized talking to our friends, putting out more of this personal finance education on our podcast, is that people are in debt. They do have credit card debt. They do have student loan debt. And Alyssa, I think something that you said that was so interesting was you chose to not necessarily have a house right away. And I think that's such a good move, because it's almost like this reflection of, okay, my values are my children. I want to be able to spend time with them as they're growing up. We're going to be a one income household. And so what we're going to choose to do is not go into a ton of debt so that other people see wealth, but instead are actually saving money in other ways and investing in the things that are most important to you. So for us, being introduced to this idea of financial independence and actually being able to save money or only spending money on things that you value, that was almost the counterexample we needed to keeping up with your peers.
Yeah, and I was going to jump in. Thank you, because I think that's a lot of what you're saying is what we're trying to foster. I actually, our family moved, and one of the reasons that we moved was because the town we were living in was a little bit higher, like middle to upper middle class. And we really felt like if we stay in this community, we're really going to be at the bottom, the bottom tier. And I was really worried about how that would impact our family as a whole. And so we moved to a community that was a little bit more middle class, and we feel very comfortable here. And so we just naturally surrounded who were about in the same, maybe financial bracket, if you will, or income bracket, and really made a conscious effort to not put ourselves at the bottom of a very wealthy community, but maybe, on par with other individuals. And I think that that's something that I wasn't thinking about at the time, that I wanted to, surround myself with similarly, leveled people. But I think that really made us not putting that additional pressure to meet standards and expectations. But I think that the other part of that is that it's also a conscious decision. And I think that that's that, I've had a lot of different conversations with my friends, stay home with my kids, but we can't do, and we're living on one. And I'm thinking in my head, you can if you wanted to. It's not for everybody. You may have to cut back in certain areas that maybe you're not willing to negotiate. But I think for us, my husband and I are very conscious about what is going to work for us. What are things where our priorities. So it kind of goes back to what you were saying, those values. We value time together. We value, I'm okay with secondhand. The kids don't know the difference, and they're probably going to break the toys at some point anyway. And so because of that, we get everything secondhand at consignment stores for Christmas presents and toys and birthdays and all those sorts of things. And I'm okay with it because I'm paying 70% off of those prices. And I actually consign their clothes as they grow out of them. I consign them so that they, I can get money back to buy the next season's clothes. There's things like that you can do. But I think that's probably like a bigger conversation of how, the actual logistics of it. But we've made it work. I have a car in the driveway that's on its last leg. But my husband and I decided we don't want to have 2 car payments. So we're going to wait till we pay off the other car, getting a new car. It's not easy because the car doesn't start some days. But you make do with what you can. And so I think that, again, it's that conscious decision to say, I'm going to live within my means and try to make that work.
And do you guys think that, your generation is different than any other generation? I mean, there's a part of me as I'm listening to you guys talking that think, okay, isn't some of that intentionality about finances just a maturation point kind of thing? I mean, I think when you're single and you start working and then you have money, you may move out of your parents' home, you may do more social things with friends. And then as you get into a different phase in your life, whether you remain single or whether you get married, then I think with those kinds of decisions come natural conversations about, well, what do we want in our life and what are we focusing on and where are we going to put either our single resource or our mutual resources together as we start to, want to buy a home or settle down or, children or whatever. I mean, is that really different for millennials? Now, I did do some reading and I did see that, millennials, really came into the forefront with the Great Recession and the bubble bursting with the banking in 2008 and stuff like that. And then a lot of people couldn't find jobs after they graduated from college. And so they might have ended up staying at home or going and getting their master's or a PhD, which has increased their school debt. And so there are some very specific generational or milestones that happened with the millennials. But on the other hand, it just sort of seems like it could just be you're going through the stages of development as you're growing. And so really are millennials that different than everybody else? So I'm just throwing that out there for discussion.
I like that question, Joji. Something that Sammy and I talk about and we sort of wonder about too is I think that's what we would expect as well, that these are sort of things that maybe you will learn. And if you have the right mindset and the right guides in your life, it almost seems inevitable that you will make those decisions. And I wonder how much social media also plays a part in that. So for millennials, I know for us, we were growing up just as Facebook and Instagram and those things were taking off. And when we talk to our friends, we don't see the same natural tendency to, cut back or be a little bit more responsible. And that's because all of a sudden you see Kylie Jenner has a Coach baby stroller that she's paying God knows what for, and you think you need one of those too. And so I do wonder how much of that for the millennial generation is seeing other people having things. And then now all of a sudden that goalpost is moving because now the Jonases aren't just the people who are in your neighborhood or in your city. It's also people that you've known your whole life that lives all over the country. And now you feel like you need to do all of these same things, partially just so you can have a photo to show people that you're successful and happy.
Yeah, that's a good point. Social media probably does play a huge part in that, because now your peer group is a whole population, and it could be global. It's not just limited to your neighborhood and things like that. And, one of the things that Alyssa said also really, I think resonated with me in the sense that when I was a single mom and I was looking at where would I go, where did I want Neela to go to school, one of the things I was really focused on was the town I live in. And that is the town that is a former town that I think Alyssa was living in. And at that time, I had no realization about what could I afford. I mean, I clearly could not afford to live here as a single mom, but I was so focused on getting Neela into the right school district that that's what I focused on, and that's what was the goal. And I will say that because her peers were in a higher socioeconomic bracket than I was in, even when I met Dan and got married to Dan, it was really interesting to see the things that would come out of her mouth and who she compared herself to. So Alyssa and Jason have the foresight to know, hey, we want our kids to feel comfortable in a certain neighborhood and feel very similar to the people that they go to school with and play with. I had no awareness of that at all. And I think that in certain ways, Neela and I struggled with that because she wanted what the other children had. I mean, her friends were living in houses that were costing, $750,000 to $2 million. And she wanted the same things that they did. And that was not possible for me. And so I became very in tune with her spending and helping her understand that there is more to life than keeping up with your friends. And that if that's all you base your self-worth on, that that's a really shallow way to live and that it will not serve you well in the long run. But those were some hard years. I mean, it started probably when she was 9 years old and it went all the way through probably when she graduated from high school because, she wanted what her friends had. And that's very normal for adolescents to want that. I just was not prepared for the ongoing angst that brought into her life and my life. So kudos to you and Jason, Alyssa, for thinking that far ahead, because you are doing your kids a favor so that they feel secure and safe in who they are, because they're not either overreaching or feeling like they're the top of the heap or the bottom of the barrel, which I think that for many years, Neela and I talked about.
Yeah, I think it's just really hard. And again, I think that we were looking at that, but I don't know that it was like a full thought process, aside from the fact that when we finally were ready to go and look for a house, we were like, we can't afford it here. So I think that, again, one of our big things prior to buying a home, we had looked at, again, I'm kind of going back to like the lessons that we've learned. We were looking at Financial Peace University. And so, we chose a real estate agent that had also been approved by Financial Peace University. And so we told her, this is our budget. This is what we're looking for. Do not show us homes in a higher bracket because we're not going to go above this. And so we were very much like, this is it. And as we started looking, we're like, well, we might have to raise that a little bit, but not by much, because this is what we can afford. And we didn't want to be house broke. And I think that, again, that was conscious efforts to really try to mold that. But it's challenging. I think every single day, I mean, I would love to say I'm off the paycheck to paycheck cycle, but I'm not. And that's something that I hope as I get older. And so I'm actually looking to you, Joji, as to, is there hope? Because I'm hoping that financially over time, we get more grounded where we are, and that maybe, as we're looking towards retirement, maybe there's different challenges, but that it kind of evolves. Like you were saying before, that, in this moment, there's a lot of challenges, but that eventually you work through them.
Right. And, going back to the discussion with Samantha and Michelle in terms of the millennials and sort of being in that population where you're two professionals and you're making an income and, really making some choices to secure your future and things like that. I also read an article by a woman who interviewed a bunch of millennials. Her name was Charlotte Cowles, and she talked about the anxiety that the millennials have, and in terms of all parts of their life. And I was wondering if that's something that is unique to. I mean, it's not unique to millennials. I mean, clearly, I know that anxiety and depression is, one of the most common things across people, just given the research out there. But do you think that there is special worries that come with being a millennial, that that anxiety is, she called it palpable in terms of different things that they're dealing with? Can you any three of you speak to that in terms of being a millennial and finding that whether you feel anxiety differently or earlier, or has there been some destabilizing factor that may lend itself to that anxiety?
I think for Sammy and I, we probably have experienced it differently. A lot of it maybe also be related to the fact that people are starting to talk about mental health and things like therapy in a very different way than our parents' generation did. For example, with our mom, we like to joke that when we first told her, when I went to see a therapist for the first time, my work was providing it, and I was just stressed out at work. Like everybody was getting fired. Every meeting I went to felt like a fight or an argument. And I was really, really trying to make it work. And so I started to talk to a therapist, and I told my mom that, and she said, "A shrink?" I was like, I don't know if that's appropriate, but we were just sort of having that conversation. I was like, this is what we talk about. This is how we're working through these things. And now, actually, a few years later, we've had so many of those conversations with her, and she's really opened up her mindset on that stuff. And now she's actually even recommended therapy to people that she knows, where she's saying, hey, this sounds like something that, you're struggling with. It might be good to talk to a therapist. My daughters have spoken to a therapist before. So I think the scale of anxiety is always difficult to measure, but I do think the conversations around mental health and seeking help, it's not like you have to be on one end of the spectrum or another. It's just a lot more accessible in terms of being a little bit more socially acceptable than, when our parents were growing up.
Yeah, I completely agree with Michelle. When I think about therapy and anxiety, I don't necessarily look at the generations above me and think, oh, they have less anxiety. I think it's also because anxiety is spoken about more that we recognize it. And, when I chose to go to therapy, I would say of all the periods of my life, it was when I was actually feeling the least anxious, but I knew it would be beneficial for me to see where these recurrent thought patterns, where they originate from, and, just help recognize the thought patterns that I have, because it is really helpful to have an outside person kind of reflect back to you what you're thinking and help pick up on those thought patterns. I think we all, do accumulate some anxieties based on the frameworks that we have. Like we think, okay, we gotta, pay attention to how we're being perceived and make sure we're well behaved. These are strategies that help us develop as adults and become people who can fit into society. But then there comes a time where we don't necessarily need that raft anymore because we're okay. And now it's time to maybe let go of some of that, some of those preoccupations, and, recognize where they come from and kind of free our mind a little bit.
Alyssa, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I was thinking about some of the things that Michelle and Sammy were saying. I think that, again, I'm kind of going back to this idea of, the different stages and phases of life. And I think that I was reflecting on, as I was coming into adulthood and would ask my mom and dad, okay, how did you manage this? How did, because we don't get to see our parents when they are in the thick of things, like buying a house. Like we grew up in the house they bought. So we didn't know what that process was for them, whether they struggled with it or anything like that. They had cars, and I think like all of those things were established. And by the time we're actually even reflecting on that, I was probably, you know, 25, 30 years old. And so now I'm asking my parents who are in their 60s and 70s, like, hey, how did you do this? And they have all this wealth of knowledge and experience that they impart on me. But so I'm kind of thinking back to your question of like, do you think we have more anxieties? Well, I don't know how that was, whether, they just had to figure it out or, there was kind of those conversations. But I think more of those conversations are being had, that we're saying, okay, hey, you've gone through this. What advice do you have? How can you help me to maneuver through it? How can you help me to not make maybe the same mistakes that you made? And so I think that's my own personal experience, but that's what I'm seeing more of, is that I'm looking to my parents and trying to learn from them. And they seem to have done pretty themselves, so then I'm trying to model myself after them. But I didn't see the anxiety or any type of changes for them, because I wasn't there in the thick of things. But I appreciate them imparting that knowledge on me, so that hopefully again I can make maybe different choices.
Yeah, I can really appreciate that. I mean, our parents are just a wealth of knowledge and in many ways experts, right? Because they've navigated these waters. So why not pick their brains and not make the same mistakes that they may have? So our time has really flown by. And I sort of wanted to end the conversation talking about what does happiness look like then for each of you? So when I think about you guys sort of leapfrogging into financial security in your, late 20s, early 30s, I'm thinking, boy, what does that mean then? Like what, where do you guys want to be, and sort of by what age? I mean, you mentioned, somebody mentioned retirement. So I'm thinking, are you thinking about you may retire at a certain point and that would give you the luxury to do X, Y, and Z? Or, yeah. So what does fulfillment look like for you? And how are you going to know when you get there?
Yeah. So for me, fulfillment is really getting to choose what I do with my time. I think, there's a lot of aspects of my job that I do love, but at the same time, I don't love that it's taking up, 40 hours plus all the extra hours after work of my time. That's what I don't love. And I think the reason Michelle and I really love getting into personal finance and finding out about, financial independence is because we know that having that knowledge gives us the ability to have financial freedom in the future. And so for me, I know like in a few years, I'm going to be like in a financial position to maybe go down to part-time and also, or less, and at that time, I can have more time to pursue things that I love, like writing, or even just have more time for my health, like exercise and meal prepping and all the things that I kind of don't get to do completely right now. I know that like by being financially stable, I'm going to have that security, and that gives me a lot of confidence and a lot of happiness. Just knowing that I can really choose what I'm going to do with my day, and part of that is because I've been really diligent and really focused on paying attention to my finances.
Yeah, I agree. I think for me specifically, when I think about my happiness, a lot of times people, when they think about personal finance or financial security, they're thinking, oh, the goal is to be rich or to have a ton of money. And the thing I like about the mindset that we talk about and that we've learned about is really that money is a tool to help unlock the things that can, once again, help you do the things that are more aligned with their value. So for me, I really, really understood this when I was about to lose my job at the end of 2020. And I had decided, actually, after speaking to our cousin Jovi, that I was going to really double down at my work. I wanted to work really hard and I even told my manager, I said, I'm not interviewing anywhere. I want you to know that I am in this and I am going to do whatever I can to improve myself. And actually, he told me, maybe you should be interviewing, which is a very shocking conversation for me. But I actually spent the next 6 months working really, really hard. And I saw that I was able to improve over time. I was growing, I was getting better, and really change the mindset of my managers and the people that were looking out for me. And that was really cool. But at the same time, a lot of my peers, when I told them, hey, I'm not interviewing, I'm not planning to look for another job right now, I want to focus on this one. Many of them asked, like, hey, like, are you okay if you lose your job? What will happen? And that was when I really realized, oh, okay, actually, I've built a little bit of a nest for myself so that I can focus on what I'm doing. And I don't have this additional money anxiety that my parents had when my dad lost his job. And so that to me just made me appreciate that money is a tool and there are ways to create that financial security. And for me, that's where my happiness comes from, is now I can actually design a life that maybe allows me to take more risks in my career. I'm writing more, I'm podcasting more, and knowing that, okay, I'm going to be okay for a little bit. And so I can optimize for happiness instead of optimizing for these traditional status symbols.
Yeah, I was going to jump in and say that I love both what Michelle and Sammy have said here, because I think that it really highlights I loved the idea, being financial secure to make time for the things that are important to you, and to really use that in a way to, I think that kind of highlights, like, if you were having a trajectory and you're looking at the ultimate goal, like the ultimate goal for happiness is to find what fulfills you and to be able to get to that point. I think that I would say that sounds great to me, and that would be my goal. Is I'm more looking at how do I get that out. It sounds like, and I may be wrong, for you, Michelle and Sammy, it sounds like you guys are on that path. I think I'm still trying to get on that path and find my footing. But my hope is that within the next couple of years, being able to find that footing that leads me in that direction. So again, like talking about, financial security and what that looks like, I'm not quite sure, but I know that having more time, being able to retire comfortably, those are goals that I have set for myself, but I'm still figuring out the steps to get there.
Alyssa, I love that you said that, because I think that's such a good perspective, because what we've seen as we've learned more about these things is that so many people in our life, no matter where they are in their financial situation, everyone is in different seasons of their life, but there's so much stuff that we're learning and different steps that people can take to build financial security. And I think we got so excited when we were learning about it. We were like, oh my gosh, we want to tell all our friends. And, sometimes it's the right time to hear that message. Sometimes it's not. And the podcast has been a really good way to set up opportunities for people to hop into that conversation with us, to the point where we'll have friends of friends reach out and say, hey, I have been in medical school for the last 10 years. I've been in debt. I'm finally getting my first job. How do I build an emergency fund? I heard you talking about it. I don't know where to start. And those kind of conversations, I think, have been just the most meaningful in terms of putting out the podcast and hearing how we can help other people who are in different seasons of their life as well.
Yeah.
And I'll contribute, I'm sorry, and say that, what I heard you guys say, which I think is so, so important, is time. I mean, the time is the one resource that we can't control beyond X amount of years that we're going to live. And I think that that's what, in my season of life, right, because I'm in my mid-50s, I'm thinking about all of a sudden, like, I'm running out of time. Like, I was so busy in my 20s and 30s and 40s building my career and really feeling proud of my work ethic and putting in 12, 14-hour days. And I think to myself, but to what end? Like, what did I accomplish with that? Because I gave away all my time, whether that was time with my family or with my child or with my partner. I mean, I just gave away that time. And so I do think that you guys are focused on the resource that we have the least amount of control on, which is also the thing that we end up valuing the most the older we get. And so having the privilege of being able to do what you want with the time you have, and know that you're still going to be able to pay your bills and do other things that you love and be creative, I think is such a gift to know in your early 30s. I cannot tell you how excited and proud I am of you guys being able to know that so early, because now you've saved yourself 20 years of not knowing that lesson and really understanding where your priorities should be, because that is the one thing that you learn at my age is that you'll never get back. And so congrats to you guys for hitting the nail on the head, because I think that is the life lesson when it comes to financial freedom, is knowing that now you can choose how to spend your time without being anxious about making ends meet. So, like I was saying before, this conversation, just the time just flew by, and I know that with Neela being probably a younger millennial, that the one thing I can say about you guys, all three of you, and my daughter who's 27, is that you guys will always be taken care of. I think that you guys are such accomplished women. You know who you are. You don't let anybody else define you. You know what your priorities are, and you will be financially healthy because you're making those decisions yourself. I wanted to take a quick minute before I, give you guys a chance to tell all of our listeners where to find you guys, because you guys are just a font of financial information. I wanted to thank you again from the bottom of my heart. You guys have been great role models to me in terms of, podcasting and putting your voice out there in the world. And you've encouraged me from the moment I mentioned I wanted to do this. So thank you so much for your love and support. I think I'm closer to you now, though I've known you my whole life, right? You guys, we're first cousins. And I just want to thank you so much for really sharing your wisdom and your heart with me, and giving me the encouragement to go ahead and know that, judgment-free zone, go out there and let your voice be heard. So thank you so much for doing that. And I'm going to turn it over to Elisa if she wants to say anything to you guys, but then please, give us the full spectrum of where our listeners can find you, what platforms, and repeat the name and the focus of your podcast. Thanks, you guys.
Yeah, I was just going to say the same thing. I'm so excited to listen into your podcast now, because I'm thinking, I need to listen and maybe join in the conversation as well. So please share with us. Before you do, though, you as well. I think that this was a great first interview for us, and an opportunity to really hear another perspective. But I'm glad that we got to have this time. So let us know where we can find you, and then we'll kind of wrap it up from there.
Yes, thank both of you. We had such a wonderful time on your podcast today. It was honestly a joy to do this interview with both of you, and we are so excited for the both of you as well. There can always be more strong women in the podcasting space. We love the message that you guys are sharing. We're already hearing our aunts talk about the fact that they've been listening into it. So it's been opening up really cool conversations, and we are so excited for you guys. We really love the podcast, and so we're so honored to be the first team that you guys are interviewing. For Sammy and us, we did just rebrand our podcast, so it's called Build a Wealthy Spirit. The crux of our podcast is that we want people to find a way to really create a life that aligns with their values. And part of that for us is helping people build a stable financial foundation. So we talk a lot about different topics around personal finance, about self-development, even relationships and stuff. And we also like to tell fun stories about our Indian parents because they're hilarious. And so we love to just share a little bit about our life on the podcast as well. So we try to keep it fun. It can be a space where people are very serious. So we like to keep it lighthearted, but we also like to make sure that people can have a takeaway from every conversation we have together. So that's buildawealthyspirit.com. We are actually
launching a new website. So you can join in on the conversation there, comment, let us know what you're thinking. And we are so excited if any of your listeners choose to take a listen to our podcast as well.
And you guys are available on what platform, or just where podcasts will be available, where people find podcasts?
That's exactly right. Our podcast, Build a Wealthy Spirit, can be found on all podcast players, Spotify, Apple, all the podcast players that you could listen to. And we love talking about finance. We think it's such a great way to get more freedom in your life. So if that's a topic that you're interested in, definitely join us. And you can join us on our website, buildawealthyspirit.com, because we actually have a space for community there too. So feel free to comment and join us there as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much. We'll wrap it up here, but we look forward to maybe having another conversation in the future. And I know I will definitely be listening in as you continue your podcast in the future.
Thank you, guys. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to our podcast, The Deconstructed Woman. If you liked this podcast, please share it with your friends, rate this episode, or subscribe to be notified of all new content. We want to hear from you, our listener. Do you have thoughts on the discussions we're having? Want to share topic suggestions, or want to join us for a topic that you're passionate about? Contact us at our email address, thedeconstructedwoman@gmail.com.